My parents controlled me, so I ran away to live with my boyfriend. But he started me. I asked my parents for help, and they gave me back to him. I don't remember a time when my parents weren't disappointed in me. My name is Ellie, I'm 35, and for as long as I can recall, I've been nothing more than a project for my parents to fix, mold, and control. Growing up, my mother, Diane, and my father, Robert, had very clear ideas about who I should be. And I was never that person. It wasn't just about grades, though believe me, my A-minuses were treated like failures. It was about every single aspect of my existence. The way I spoke, the way I dressed, the friends I had, my hobbies, everything was scrutinized and corrected. My mother, a former nurse who quit after marrying my father, has always been obsessed with appearances. Ellie, stand up straight. You look weak, she'd snap in public. Don't talk so much, you're embarrassing yourself. Her favorite insult was calling me pitiful, as if I were some fragile, pathetic thing barely capable of surviving in the world without her. My father, a retired engineer, was more emotionally distant. He rarely spoke unless it was to point out a mistake or compare me unfavorably to someone else's child. I was their only child, which should have meant I got all their love and attention. Instead, I got all their expectations and disappointments condensed into one suffocating force. The worst part was that no matter what I did, it was never enough. I got into a great college, not their first choice, but still impressive. They acted as if I had thrown my life away. What's wrong with Stanford? My mother asked when I picked a university closer to home. You'll never succeed if you limit yourself like this. When I landed a solid job in marketing right after graduation, their reaction wasn't pride, but skepticism. Marketing? My father scoffed. That's not a real career. You'll be unemployed in 5 years. That was 13 years ago, and I'm still thriving. Not that they'd ever acknowledge it. Even when I got married, my parents made it miserable. They didn't like Liam, my husband. He was too relaxed, too ambitious in the wrong ways, not serious enough. The reality? He was kind, supportive, and the only person who ever made me feel like I was enough. Last year, I got a big promotion, director of marketing, a huge milestone. I told my parents, hoping maybe, just maybe, they'd say something nice. Instead, my mother sighed. Well, that sounds stressful. Are you sure you can handle it? And my father? He just muttered, well, you should have aimed for vice president by now. That was it. Something inside me snapped. I realized that day that they were never going to change. They would never be proud of me. They would never see me as enough. I could cure cancer, win a Nobel Prize, walk on water, and they would still find a way to belittle it. So I stopped trying. I stopped calling as much. I stopped visiting. I pulled back. And then, something happened that I wasn't prepared for. A few months into my quiet withdrawal, my mother called, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. Ellie, we haven't seen you in ages. Don't you care about your family? I sighed. Mom, I've just been really busy with work. Oh, I see. So your big important job matters more than your own parents? Here we go. She started crying, saying she and Dad were getting older and that one day we'll be gone, and then you'll regret how you treated us. The manipulation was textbook, but still, it hit me. Guilt is a powerful tool, especially when wielded by a mother who has spent decades perfecting the art of emotional warfare. I agreed to come over for dinner that Sunday. The second I stepped into their house, I regretted it. My father barely acknowledged me. My mother looked me up and down, immediately commenting, "You've gained a little weight. You need to take care of yourself, sweetheart." I was 5 minutes in, and she was already criticizing me. Dinner was tense. They asked nothing about my life, but had plenty to say about theirs. Complaints about their neighbors, about the decline of society, about how kids today are ungrateful and selfish. Then my father turned to me and said, "So, when are you finally having kids? You're not getting any younger." I clenched my fork. Liam and I haven't decided if we want kids. My mother gasped, as if I had just declared I was quitting my job to join a cult. Ellie, what kind of woman doesn't want children? A happy one. I shot back. That was the wrong thing to say. My mother exploded. She ranted about how I was denying her grandchildren, how she sacrificed everything for me, how I was selfish beyond belief. My father just shook his head, like I was some lost cause. I stood up, heart pounding. You know what? I don't have to put up with this. My mother's face twisted. Oh, so now you're abandoning your family? No, Mom, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. I'm choosing myself for once. I walked out, my parents shouting after me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care. They called. They texted. They guilt-tripped. My mother left a dramatic voicemail sobbing about how she couldn't believe her own daughter would do this. My father's messages were cold. You're making a huge mistake. I ignored them. Weeks passed, and the guilt slowly started to fade, replaced by something I hadn't felt in years: relief. I wasn't free yet, but for the first time, I saw a glimpse of what freedom could feel like, and I knew I could never go back. I was 25 when I married Jeff, and I thought I had finally escaped my parents' suffocating control. But I was wrong. I didn't escape. I just traded one form of manipulation for another, and this time, it came with bruises. Jeff was everything my parents weren't. Or at least, that's what I believed at first. He was charming, funny, and made me feel special in a way I had never experienced. After years of being told I wasn't enough, Jeff looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. That kind of attention was intoxicating. I mistook it for love. The first year was perfect. He was attentive, affectionate, and always knew what to say to make me feel safe. He brought me flowers for no reason, cooked dinner when I was exhausted from work, and always insisted that he just wanted to take care of me. I should have seen the warning signs in those words. I should have noticed how he slowly isolated me from my friends, how he made little digs about my family, how he subtly convinced me that he was the only person who truly understood me. It wasn't sudden. It never is. The first time he raised his voice at me, it shocked me. We were arguing about something small, what to watch on TV, I think. He snapped, his voice sharp, his eyes dark. But then, just as quickly, he softened. He pulled me into his arms, kissing my forehead, whispering, "I'm sorry, baby. Work has been stressing me out. I'd never hurt you." I believed him. The first slap came a year later. We were at a friend's party, and I laughed a little too much at someone's joke. Jeff's jaw tightened, his hand clenching his glass so hard I thought it would shatter. The car ride home was silent, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel, his whole body radiating rage. The second we stepped inside, he grabbed my wrist, hard. "Do you think you're funny? Flirting with other men like that?" "I wasn't flirting, Jeff. I was just talking." The slap came so fast, so hard, that I stumbled. My cheek burned, tears springing to my eyes from the sheer shock of it. He stood over me, chest heaving, but the anger in his face faded almost instantly. Then came the apologies, the tears, the desperation in his voice. "Baby, I didn't mean it. You just make me crazy sometimes. I love you so much. I can't stand the thought of losing you." And I believed him. Again. I told myself it was a mistake, that it was stress, that it wouldn't happen again. But it did. And each time, the apologies became more manipulative. He convinced me it was my fault, that I pushed him too far, that if I was just a little more understanding, a little more careful with my words, he wouldn't get so angry. I started walking on eggshells. Every aspect of my life became about managing Jeff's moods. What I wore, what I said, who I talked to. It was all dictated by what might set him off. If I stayed perfectly in line, maybe he'd stay the man I fell in love with. But the thing about men like Jeff is that there is no perfect behavior that will keep them satisfied. They always find a reason. By the time I was 27, I barely recognized myself. I stopped seeing friends. Every time I tried, Jeff would create a crisis. He'd get sick, or have a bad day at work, or suddenly need me to stay home. If I insisted on going out, he'd make me pay for it later. Maybe it was the silent treatment. Maybe it was slamming doors so hard that the walls shook. Maybe it was worse. I started lying to myself, convincing myself that things weren't as bad as they seemed. After all, he wasn't like those men on the news who put their wives in the hospital. He didn't hit me often, and when he did, it was never hard enough to leave marks that wouldn't fade in a day. But the worst part wasn't the physical abuse. It was the way he made me feel like I was nothing. He'd tell me I was stupid, that I was lucky he put up with me. He'd mock my job, say that no one respected me, that if I left him, I'd be alone forever. "No one else would want you," he whispered in my ear one night, his fingers tightening around my wrist. "You should be grateful I love you." And I was. That's the sickest part of it. He had broken me down so completely that I was grateful for his love. One night, he came home drunk. I could smell the whiskey on him before he even opened his mouth. His eyes were wild, his body tense. "Who are you talking to today?" he slurred. "No one, Jeff. Just my co-workers." He stepped closer. Liar. I barely saw the punch coming. It landed on my ribs, knocking the air out of me. I crumpled to the floor, gasping. But he didn't stop. He grabbed my hair, yanking my head back. "You think you can cheat on me?" I wasn't. His hand tightened around my throat. I don't know what would have happened if his phone hadn't rung at that moment. The sound made him pause just long enough for me to scramble away, choking for breath. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the bruises forming. Something inside me broke. I had spent so long convincing myself that this was love, that this was normal. But it wasn't. I wasn't living. I was surviving. The next morning, I called my best friend, Ava, someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a year. My voice shook as I asked her to meet me. When I saw her, I burst into tears. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't judge me. She just held me as I cried. "Ellie," she said softly, "you need to get out." And for the first time, I believed her. The escape wasn't easy. Jeff didn't just let me go. But that's another story. What matters is that I survived. I got out, and I never looked back. I don't remember making the decision to leave Jeff. It wasn't some grand epiphany, no dramatic moment of clarity. It was survival instinct. One night, after another violent outburst, another round of accusations that I was cheating, lying, disrespecting him, I knew if I didn't leave soon, I might never get the chance. He was getting worse. I waited until he left for work. My ribs were still sore from the last time. My cheek faintly bruised, but I forced myself to move. I took only what I could carry: important documents, a few clothes, my phone, and some cash I had secretly stashed away over the last few months. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to go. The only place I could think to go was my parents' house. That was my first mistake. I hadn't spoken to them in months, not since I had started pulling away from their constant control. But I was desperate. I had nowhere else to turn. When I showed up at their doorstep, my mother's face twisted in disapproval. She didn't greet me, didn't ask if I was okay. Instead, she took one look at me, disheveled, shaking, my eyes still red from crying, and said, "What on earth happened to you?" I was exhausted, my entire body running on adrenaline and fear. "Mom, I need to stay here. Just for a little while." She frowned. "Why? Where's Jeff?" That single question made my stomach twist. I stepped inside, glancing over at my father, who was sitting in his usual chair, flipping through the newspaper like nothing was happening. "I left him." My voice was barely above a whisper. My mother sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose like I had just told her I'd lost my job or crashed my car. "Ellie, marriage isn't easy. You can't just run away every time things get hard." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My entire body was covered in evidence of what Jeff had done to me, and she was treating it like some petty marital spat. "He hit me, Mom." The words tasted bitter in my mouth. That made my father look up, but there was no anger, no concern. Just disappointment. "What did you do to set him off?" My breath caught in my throat. My mother nodded, like that was a perfectly reasonable question. "You've always been difficult, Ellie. Maybe if you didn't push his buttons, he wouldn't have gotten so upset." I felt like I was going to be sick. I had spent years trying to convince myself that my parents' treatment of me wasn't abuse, that they were just strict, just overbearing, just too invested in my life. But standing there, in that house, listening to them justify Jeff's violence, I realized something. They had never protected me. Not when I was a child. Not when I was a teenager. And not now. I swallowed back my anger, my disbelief. "I just need a place to stay for a few nights. Please." My mother pursed her lips. "I don't think that's a good idea. It wouldn't be right to keep you here when your husband is probably worried sick about you." "Worried sick?" I laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "He's going to kill me, Mom." "Oh, stop being dramatic," she snapped. "Men get angry. That's just how they are. It doesn't mean they don't love you." I should have left right then, but I was too tired, too desperate to believe they would actually turn me away. I begged. I told them I had nowhere else to go. My father sighed, like I was inconveniencing him. "Fine. One night. But in the morning, you need to go home and work things out with Jeff." It wasn't much, but I had no other option. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every creak in the house made my pulse spike. I kept expecting Jeff to burst through the door, his hands around my throat, his voice hissing that I had nowhere to run. But morning came, and I was still alive. I crept downstairs, heart pounding. My parents were sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, talking in hushed voices. The moment they saw me, they went silent. Then the doorbell rang. Every muscle in my body tensed. I turned to my mother, who was suddenly avoiding my gaze. My father didn't look at me either, just took another slow sip of his coffee. My stomach dropped. No, my voice was barely a whisper. The doorbell rang again, then pounding. "Ellie, I know you're in there." Jeff's voice. Cold terror flooded my veins. I turned to my parents, panic rising in my chest. You called him? My mother had the audacity to look offended. Of course we did. He's your husband. He deserves to know where you are. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My voice broke. You just handed me over to him. My father set down his mug. It's for the best. Marriage is about commitment. You made a vow, Ellie. The pounding got louder. Ellie, open the damn door. I stepped back, shaking my head. No. No, no, no. My mother sighed, exasperated. You're acting ridiculous. Just talk to him like an adult. She moved toward the door, and pure panic took over. I bolted. I ran for the back door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, I heard my mother call my name, her voice sharp with irritation. I burst into the backyard, feet slamming against the pavement, lungs burning. I didn't stop, didn't dare look back. I vaulted over the fence, landing hard on the other side, knees scraping against the ground. Then I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran. I could hear Jeff's voice behind me, could hear him shouting my name, cursing my parents for not stopping me. But I didn't stop. I kept running until my legs gave out, until my vision blurred, until I collapsed behind a gas station, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling so hard I could barely type. One number. The only person I could trust. I called Ava. She picked up on the first ring. Ellie. Her voice was groggy, but the second she heard me sob, she was wide awake. Where are you? I choked on a breath. I need help. And for the first time in years, someone actually helped me. After my parents betrayed me, after Jeff nearly caught me, after I collapsed in that alley gasping for breath, I knew one thing. I had to disappear. Ava was the only person who didn't turn her back on me. When I showed up at her apartment, bruised, shaking, barely able to form a sentence, she didn't hesitate. She let me in, locked the door and said, "Whatever you need, we'll figure it out." For 3 days, I hid in her tiny guest room, jumping at every noise. I barely ate, barely slept. Every time a car passed by her window, I thought it was Jeff. On the 4th day, Ava sat on the bed next to me and said, "You can't stay here." Panic surged through me. "I don't have anywhere else to go." "Yes, you do," she said gently. "We're getting you out of here." That night, we made a plan. We'd use Ava's savings to buy a bus ticket in cash. No credit cards, no digital trail. I deleted my social media, wiped my phone, threw away my SIM card. We packed a duffel bag with the essentials, and at 3 in the morning, she drove me to the bus station. "Where do you want to go?" she asked as we stood in front of the ticket counter. I stared at the map of destinations, heart pounding. Far. That's how I ended up 1,200 kilometers away in a city I'd never been to, starting a life I didn't recognize as my own. The first few weeks were brutal. I found a cheap apartment, if you could even call it that. It was a one-room shoebox with a mattress on the floor and a sink that never stopped leaking. The walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbors arguing at all hours. But it was mine. And most importantly, Jeff had no idea where I was. I took whatever jobs I could get. Temp work, freelance gigs, even a few overnight shifts at a diner. Anything to keep my head above water. I barely slept. I barely ate. But I was free. Still, freedom didn't feel like I thought it would. I kept waiting for the fear to go away, but it didn't. Every time I walked down the street, I felt eyes on me. Every time a man raised his voice, my stomach clenched. I still flinched at sudden movements. One night, I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought I was dying. It took me a full minute to realize it was a panic attack. That was the night I finally called a therapist. Therapy was the hardest thing I ever did. The first session, I could barely get a word out. I sat there, hands clenched in my lap, staring at the floor as Dr. Mitchell, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes, waited patiently. "I don't know what's wrong with me," I finally whispered. She tilted her head. "Ellie, after what you've been through, I'd be more worried if you weren't struggling." I broke down sobbing. Week after week, I started unraveling everything. My childhood, my marriage, the betrayal of my parents, the way I had spent my entire life thinking love meant suffering. "You were conditioned to believe that being controlled was normal," Dr. Mitchell told me one day. "That's why you didn't see the red flags. But you see them now, don't you?" I did. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be the version of myself that made other people comfortable. I was learning who I actually was. And it turned out, I wasn't weak. I fell in love with UX design by accident. I had been doing random admin work for a small tech startup when one of the designers quit. In the chaos, I got pulled in to help. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was good at understanding what people needed, at seeing the flaws in a system and figuring out how to fix them. It was the first time in years that something excited me. I enrolled in an online course. I studied at night, practicing for hours after my shifts. The more I learned, the more I fell in love with it. For the first time, I was building something instead of just surviving. 6 months later, I landed my first real UX job. I didn't tell anyone, but when I signed the contract, I locked myself in my bathroom and cried. Not because I was scared, but because, for the first time in my life, I was proud of myself. I met Brian at a coffee shop. I wasn't looking for anyone. Honestly, I was terrified of the idea of dating again, but he wasn't like the others. I had been sitting at my usual table, drowning in design mock-ups, when he sat down at the table next to mine. "That's a lot of rectangles," he said, nodding at my screen. I looked up, startled. He was older, maybe 40, dressed in a button-down and jeans, with a warm, easy smile. "It's UX," I said cautiously. He grinned. "I know. I run a software company." That got my attention. He introduced himself, Brian Carter, founder of a mid-sized tech firm downtown. We ended up talking for over an hour about design, usability, and how most apps were frustratingly bad. It was the first conversation with a man that didn't make me feel small. Over the next few weeks, we kept running into each other at the coffee shop. It felt easy, like talking to him didn't take effort. He never pushed, never made me uncomfortable. One day, he asked me out for dinner. I almost said no, not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid. Dr. Mitchell's voice echoed in my head. Not every man is Jeff, so I said yes. Brian was different. He never made me feel like I had to shrink myself. He didn't demand to know where I was every second of the day, didn't get angry when I had an opinion. He actually listened. On our 4th date, I told him about Jeff. I expected him to recoil, to pity me, to look at me like I was damaged. But he just reached across the table and took my hand. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, "except that I think you're incredible for surviving that." And for the first time, I believed it. It's been 2 years since I left. 2 years since I ran for my life. 2 years since I became a different person. I'm not fully healed. I don't think I ever will be. But I'm no longer just surviving. I'm living. I hadn't thought about my parents in a long time. Not really. They had been a distant, painful memory, like an old scar I had learned to live with. The last time I saw them, they had handed me over to Jeff like I was nothing more than a runaway pet who needed to be returned to its rightful owner. That betrayal had burned itself into my bones. It had taken years to get to a place where their voices weren't in my head every time I made a decision. And then, out of nowhere, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in years. It was my mother. I stared at the screen, my stomach tightening. She had tried calling a few times over the years, but I had always let it go to voicemail. I had long since accepted that they would never change, that I was better off without them. But something about this call felt different. It was the middle of the afternoon, a random Tuesday. My life was calm now. I had a good job, good friends, and Brian, who had shown me what love was supposed to feel like. My world had finally settled. And then, just like that, my past was knocking on the door. I let it ring until it stopped. Less than a minute later, a text came through. "Ellie, please call me back. It's important." I should have ignored it, but curiosity got the best of me. I wanted to know what was so urgent after all this time. I called back. My mother picked up immediately. "Ellie," she breathed, like she had been waiting her whole life for me to call her. "Oh, sweetheart. I'm so glad you answered." There was something off about her voice. It wasn't warm or remorseful. It was rehearsed. "What do you want?" I asked flatly. A pause. Then a sigh. "Your father and I, we saw the documentary." My grip on the phone tightened. My mouth went dry. I knew exactly what she was talking about. A few months ago, a documentary had been released about Jeff, his business deals, his money laundering, his tax fraud. It was all out in the open now. The world knew what I had lived through, how he had controlled every aspect of my life while stealing millions from investors. He had been arrested shortly after the documentary aired, and for the first time since leaving him, I truly felt safe. My mother cleared her throat. We had no idea, Ellie. If we had known what kind of man he was." I laughed. It was sharp, bitter. "Stop. Just stop." She kept talking, as if I hadn't said anything. "It's just, people can be very manipulative. He fooled everyone, Ellie. He was so charming, so successful. No one could have known." I felt my chest tighten with rage. I told you. My voice was shaking. I came to you, covered in bruises, and you handed me back to him. Don't you dare say you didn't know. Silence. I could hear her breathing, but she didn't argue. She knew I was right. I know you must be upset, she finally said, her voice soft, calculated. But you have to understand, we didn't do it to hurt you. We truly thought we were helping. I nearly threw my phone across the room. Helping. They had been helping Jeff, not me. They had always seen him as the better option. My father had liked him because he was a man's man, the kind of husband who kept his wife in line. My mother had adored him because he was wealthy, well-connected, everything she thought I should have in a partner. I had spent years trying to understand how they could do it, how they could look me in the eye, battered and desperate, and still side with the man who hurt me. But the truth was simple. They had never seen me as a person, just a reflection of their own values. They had chosen their pride over my life. And now that the whole world knew what Jeff was, they wanted to rewrite history. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. Why are you really calling me? She hesitated. We wanted to make things right. We wanted to explain. I waited. Then it hit me. You're embarrassed, I said. That's what this is about. No, she said quickly, too quickly. Ellie, we just want you to know that we love you. We always have. We were just misled and I cut her off. You're justifying yourselves. That's what this is. You don't care about what you did to me. You just care that people might find out. Silence again. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. Do you know what it was like? My voice was quieter now, but it was steady. Do you know how it felt to be alone, to have nowhere to go, because my own parents chose my abuser over me? Ellie. No, I shook my head. You don't get to pretend you didn't know. You don't get to rewrite history just because you don't like how you look in it. Her voice wavered. We just thought you'd be happier with him. I felt something inside me go ice cold. That's the difference between us, I said. You think happiness is about appearances. You thought I'd be happy because he had money, because he looked successful. You never cared about whether I was actually safe. You never cared about me. Her breath hitched. That's not true. Yes, it is. I felt so calm now, detached. You never loved me. You loved the idea of me. And when I didn't fit into that idea, you threw me away. There was nothing left to say. For years, I had imagined this moment. I had pictured them begging for forgiveness, crying, telling me how sorry they were. But that wasn't what this was. This wasn't about me. It was about their guilt, their need to be seen as good parents. I didn't owe them that. I don't need your apology, I said. I needed your help. And you chose him. Ellie, please, she whispered. We don't want to lose you. I laughed again, but this time it wasn't bitter. It was light, almost amused. You lost me years ago. I hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time, waiting for the guilt to come. The regret. The old ache of wanting their approval. But there was nothing. I had finally set myself free. I had spent years carefully removing my parents from my life, carving out a space where they couldn't reach me, where their voices no longer dictated my choices. I had thought I was free. I was wrong. The first time I saw them again was at Lily's concert. It was supposed to be a special night. Lily had been practicing for months, rehearsing endlessly, humming her songs under her breath at breakfast, tapping out rhythms on the kitchen counter. Brian and I had helped her pick out a dress, told her 100 times how proud we were of her. She was nervous but excited, the way any 12-year-old would be before standing on stage in front of a packed auditorium. I had spent the entire day making sure she felt supported. And then, in an instant, it all came crashing down. The concert had already started. I was sitting next to Brian in the dim auditorium, surrounded by other parents, their cameras poised, their faces glowing with quiet anticipation. Lily was sitting backstage, waiting for her turn, and I had just started to relax when I saw them. My mother and father. I felt my entire body go rigid. They were standing near the entrance, scanning the rows of seats, their expressions eager, expectant, like they belonged here, like they had every right to be in this space, in this life I had built without them. I could hardly breathe. Brian noticed the shift in my posture, the way my hands clenched against my knees. Ellie, he murmured. I couldn't answer. Then, before I could even process what was happening, my mother locked eyes with me. Her entire face lit up. She nudged my father, whispering something, and then, before I could move, before I could even react, they were walking toward us. Brian followed my gaze, his expression darkening. Are you kidding me? I didn't respond. I was too busy trying to slow my heartbeat, trying to convince myself this wasn't happening. But it was. They stopped right beside our row. My mother beamed at me, as if we were old friends meeting by chance, as if she hadn't spent years pretending I didn't exist. Ellie, sweetheart, we thought that was you. I could feel the eyes of the parents around us shifting toward the scene. A few curious glances, the uncomfortable shuffle of strangers realizing they were about to witness something personal. I swallowed hard. What are you doing here? My mother's smile didn't falter. Oh, we wouldn't miss our granddaughter's big night. My stomach dropped. The air seemed to thicken. My mind struggled to catch up. They were talking about Lily. My father chimed in, nodding. We wanted to support her. She's family, after all. I heard Brian inhale sharply beside me. His jaw clenched. Lily had never met them. She didn't even know their names. They weren't her grandparents. They were strangers. I stood up so fast my seat creaked. You need to leave. Now. A murmur rippled through the surrounding audience. My mother's expression flickered with something. Annoyance? Disbelief? Like she couldn't understand why I wasn't immediately embracing her. Ellie, don't be like this, she said, her voice sweet but firm. The same condescending tone she had used on me my entire life. We have every right to be here. No, you don't, Brian said, standing beside me now. His voice was steady, but I could feel the tension radiating off of him. You're not her grandparents. You don't even know her. My father's face darkened. That's not our fault. I almost laughed. The sheer audacity of it. Brian didn't flinch. Leave. Now. A few heads had turned toward us. The murmurs were getting louder. People were watching. My mother let out a soft, disapproving sigh, shaking her head like I was the one making a scene. Then, she turned her attention to the stage, scanning the lineup of children waiting in the wings. I felt sick. She was looking for her. Lily's name was printed clearly in the program, alongside her school's logo, the class list, the names of every student participating in the concert. My mother reached for one, flipping through it casually, as if she belonged here, as if she had any right to know anything about Lily. I snatched it from her hands. I swear to God, if you go anywhere near her. My father scoffed. You're overreacting. No, Brian said sharply. She's not. Something about his tone must have unsettled them, because my mother's smile faltered. My father shifted, glancing toward the entrance, as if suddenly remembering they were surrounded by dozens of other parents, all now actively pretending not to eavesdrop. I forced myself to take a deep breath. My heart was hammering, but I kept my voice low, controlled. If you don't leave, I'll call security. My mother's expression twisted with something ugly. Ellie, don't be ridiculous. Brian had already pulled out his phone. I'm not joking. Leave, or we'll have you escorted out. That was the moment they realized we weren't bluffing. My mother's face flickered with something unreadable. Anger, maybe. Resentment. My father muttered something under his breath, his hands curling into fists at his sides, but he didn't argue. Without another word, they turned and walked away. I didn't sit back down until I saw them disappear through the exit doors. Even then, my entire body was wound so tightly I thought I might shatter. Brian's hand found mine. His grip was firm, grounding. You okay? I exhaled, my breath shaky. I don't know. Lily's group was getting ready to perform. I forced myself to focus, to push everything else aside. This was her night. She deserved to have it be about her. But even as the music started, even as I clapped and cheered and smiled, my skin still crawled with the memory of my mother's voice. They hadn't come for Lily. They had come for control, and I wasn't going to let them take it. I should have known it wasn't over. After the concert, after my parents showed up uninvited and tried to insert themselves into Lily's life, I thought that was the worst of it. I thought they had crossed their final boundary, that I had made myself clear. I was wrong. The betrayal that followed made everything before it seem almost laughable in comparison. It started with a phone call I should never have answered. It was a Sunday morning, quiet and peaceful, the kind of morning I had worked so hard to have in my life. Brian and Lily were still asleep, and I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, scrolling through my phone, just existing. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a life I actually wanted. Then my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. I put the phone to my ear. Hello? The second I heard the voice on the other end, my stomach twisted. It was my mother. Ellie, she said, her tone light, almost casual, like we spoke every day instead of barely at all. I was wondering when you'd finally pick up. I should have hung up right then, but something in her voice, something smug, something knowing, made me pause. I sighed. already exhausted. What do you want? Oh, don't be like that, she said. Your father and I just wanted to talk to you. We've been doing some thinking. Thinking. That word alone was enough to send a chill down my spine. I kept my voice steady. Thinking about what? There was a pause, just long enough to set me on edge. Then, her next words sent a bolt of pure ice through me. We've been in contact with Jeff. My breath caught in my throat. I must have misheard her. I had to have misheard her. What? We just thought it was only fair to hear his side of the story, she continued, as if she were talking about an old friend and not the man who had nearly destroyed me. After all, things got so messy between you two. I gripped my coffee cup so tightly I thought it might shatter. Messy. That was the word she used. Not violent. Not terrifying. Not abusive. Just messy. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. You talked to Jeff? My mother sighed like I was being difficult. Well, yes. We reached out a while ago. We just wanted to understand the full picture. You were so emotional when you left, and, well, sometimes people exaggerate. I nearly dropped the phone. Exaggerate. I had told them everything. I had stood in their house, bruised and broken, and begged them for help. And now, years later, after seeing my name dragged into a documentary, after watching the world finally understand what Jeff was, they had still reached out to him. I forced my voice to stay even. What did he say? Oh, he was very reasonable, she said. He told us how hard things were for him too, how much stress he was under. He admitted he wasn't perfect, but, Ellie, I have to say, you never told us about all the pressure you put on him. You always did have a bit of a temper. My ears started ringing. A bit of a temper. I could barely process what I was hearing. They weren't just speaking to Jeff. They were believing him. You're defending him, I whispered. My mother made a tisk sound. We're just trying to be fair, Ellie. You can't expect us to take sides without understanding everything. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Take sides. That was what this was to them. A game. A debate. A situation where both parties had equally valid perspectives. I was shaking. My pulse pounded so loudly in my ears, I thought I might pass out. He nearly killed me, I said, my voice raw. And you're talking to him like he's the victim? Oh, stop being dramatic, she said, exasperated. He regrets things, Ellie. He told us how much he loved you, how devastated he was when you left. I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. He choked me. Silence. Then, after a long pause, she let out a soft sigh. Well, I'm sure you weren't completely innocent either. That was it. That was the moment something inside me broke. For years, I had carried the hope, small, buried, but still there, that maybe one day they would realize what they had done. That maybe, at some point, they would feel guilt, shame, something. But they didn't. They never had. And they never would. I took a deep, shaking breath. When I spoke again, my voice was ice. I want you to listen very carefully, she huffed. Ellie, no, you do not get to talk. Not anymore. I stood up, gripping my phone so hard my fingers ached. You have no idea what he did to me. And you don't care. You never cared. You handed me back to him. You tried to force me to stay in that nightmare. And now, after everything, you're still choosing him over me. Oh, sweetheart, that's not. I cut her off. We are done. Forever. A sharp inhale. You are not my parents. You are nothing to me. And if you ever contact me again, if you ever try to come near me or my family, I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of people you are. My mother's voice tightened. You don't mean that. I do. I swallowed the lump in my throat, my heart hammering, my hands shaking. I hope you enjoy your conversations with Jeff, because he's the only child you have now. Then I hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hands, waiting for the pain to come, the regret, the guilt. It never did. For the first time in my life, I felt free. I thought I had finally cut them off for good. After the last call, after hearing my mother defend Jeff, after realizing there was nothing left to salvage, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known before. Then they went after Lily. It started with a phone call from the school. I was in a meeting at work when my phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number, and normally, I wouldn't have answered, but something told me to pick up. Hello? Mrs. Carter? The voice on the other end was polite but cautious. This is Jennifer Marks, the principal at Lily's school. I wanted to reach out because something unusual happened today, and I think you need to be aware of it. I sat up straighter. What happened? She hesitated. A couple came to the school today claiming to be Lily's grandparents. They asked to see her. The blood in my veins turned to ice. I gripped my phone tighter. Did they talk to her? No, she assured me. Our policy requires parental approval for any unregistered visitors, so they weren't allowed to interact with her. But they were persistent. They kept insisting that they had rights as her grandparents and that they wanted to be involved in her life. My entire body went rigid. What did they say? Jennifer sighed. They claimed you were preventing them from seeing her unfairly, that you were keeping family away from her. They even asked about scheduling meetings with her teachers, as if they were responsible for her education. A hot wave of anger surged through me. They had gone too far. Did they leave? I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. Yes, she confirmed. But I need to be honest with you, Ellie. They were pushy. If they come back, we may need a legal directive to keep them away. I clenched my jaw. Don't worry. That's exactly what I'm going to do. That night, I sat down with Brian and told him everything. He was furious. I had never seen him so angry before. Not like this, not with his whole body tense, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. They have lost their goddamn minds, he said. This isn't just them being manipulative anymore. This is harassment. I nodded, swallowing hard. They won't stop. They don't care about Lily. They don't care about me. They just want control. Brian leaned forward, his eyes burning with determination. We're getting a restraining order. This ends now. The next morning, we met with a lawyer. Her name was Rachel Stein, and she wasted no time. They've already escalated by showing up at the school, she said, flipping through the paperwork we had compiled. That gives us a strong case for immediate legal action. Given their previous harassment and history with you, we can file for a no-contact order that includes Lily. If they violate it, they'll face serious financial and legal consequences. Brian placed a firm hand on my knee under the table, grounding me. We want the maximum protection possible. Rachel nodded. That means we push for a financial penalty. A $50,000 fine for any violation. I exhaled, feeling something inside me settle. Do it. The process moved quickly. We had records of their previous behavior, their uninvited appearance at the concert, the history with Jeff, my past attempts to cut ties. The school was more than willing to provide a statement about their recent visit. Within a week, we had the restraining order in place. It was official. If they so much as stepped near Lily again, they'd be fined $50,000 per violation. If they tried to contact me, they could be arrested for harassment. I should have felt relieved, but part of me still wondered if they would listen. They didn't. 3 days later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Jennifer Marks. They came back, she said immediately. They tried again. I gritted my teeth. What happened? We reminded them of the restraining order. They argued. They claimed they had a right to see Lily, that they would take legal action against you for keeping them away from their grandchild. My blood boiled. They aren't her grandparents. Jennifer sighed. I know that, but they don't care. Security escorted them out, and we filed a report. We also called the police since they violated the order. My heart pounded. And they're being fined. She hesitated. Ellie, I don't think they're going to stop. Neither did I. That night, Brian and I sat Lily down. She was sitting on the couch, curled up in her favorite oversized hoodie, her hair still damp from her shower. She looked between us, her expression wary. Did I do something wrong? I shook my head quickly. No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. Brian exhaled slowly. We need to tell you something about some people who have been trying to see you. Lily's brows furrowed. Who? I swallowed hard. My parents. She blinked, confused. I didn't even know you had parents. That hit me like a slap. I forced myself to take a breath. There's a reason for that, I said softly. They're not good people, Lily. They've hurt me in ways that I can't even explain. And now, they're trying to force themselves into your life. But we're not going to let them. She frowned. Why would they even want to see me? Brian's expression hardened. Not for the right reasons. They're not doing this because they love you. They're doing this to control Ellie. Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she asked, Are they going to come here? Brian didn't hesitate. No, we made sure of that. They're not allowed near you. If they try, they'll get into serious trouble. She nodded slowly, processing. Okay. Then she turned to me, her big brown eyes full of quiet understanding. I don't want to meet them. I felt my throat tighten. I reached for her hand, squeezing gently. You don't have to. Ever. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. My parents had tried every trick they had left. They had manipulated, they had invaded, They had pushed every boundary, but they had failed. I wasn't that scared, desperate girl anymore. They no longer had power over me, and they never would again.